who you were working with. But anyway, let's, why don't you go on to the next one. Peter's already given you his idea, his objectives for the session today. I wanted to say a little bit about that as well. Generally, when I talk about climate ethics, I want to certainly give you an overview of what some of the climate ethical issues are, the implications, the ethical implications are on climate. But also I want you to be thinking about the climate issues and where each of you stands with respect to climate issues. They're not easy answers to the ethical questions relating to climate change. Each of us has to examine our own values and bring them to the climate situation and decide how we think they interact and where we think we as individuals, as communities, as nations, as an international community should be moving with respect to climate change. We certainly do want to talk about ethical issues and the complicating factors, why it's so hard to talk about ethics or to talk about policy issues of climate change in general. And we're also going to talk today about how to engage other people in discussion about ethical issues, because my feeling is if we don't get our friends, families, and colleagues engaged in these discussions, nothing is going to happen on climate change. We really have to get some, I say we have to bring the ethical debate home. We have to get people thinking about what's right and fair with respect to climate change so that if and when we do get an international agreement put together and people bring it back home, that we can get it ratified by our individual countries. I'm starting with one of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change graphics just to show you a little bit about the causes of climate change. Because there is a lot of people talk about the uncertainties in climate change. The scientific uncertainties are massive. There's no doubt about that, but there's very little uncertainty about the fact that our climate is changing and that it's driven by both natural and human factors. And in this particular set of graphs, and you can see that it's been broken out by each particular continent. If you look at the blue area, this is how climate models would predict the climate if you only included natural factors. So the blue is just how climate would be changing in each of these areas if we only looked at natural factors. If you go back then and add in human factors, if you add in greenhouse gas emissions like carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, you add in deforestation and other human drivers of climate change, that changes the way the models operate, and you get the pink part of the graph. And then the line is just the average of these different models. And you'll see in each case that on each continent, the graph is rising over time. This is 1900 to 2000. So we have let's see, we have temperatures going up. This is just temperature. Average temperatures going up. And the pink line in all cases, or the pink area, is above the blue area. So on all continents across the globe, we find that human factors are contributing to climate change. So I just want to say that most of the uncertainties in climate change comes with how specific things operate. There's a great deal of consensus. This doesn't mean that everyone agrees, but many, many scientists now agree that our climate is changing and that humans are contributing to it. That's important because if human factors are involved, that's what triggers the ethical issues. That's when we get down to issues of human responsibility. Okay, if you switch from this here. And this is another Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change figure. I'm just going to talk about this for a minute, but this is a nice little figure. This will be on the website. It's a nice thing to use if you're talking with other people because it talks both about natural and human systems. It talks about some of the things, such as emissions, that drive climate change, the kinds of impacts and vulnerability that we have, the effects on water resources, food security, and other issues, some of the mediating factors down here, and some of the actions that we can take, such as mitigation and adaptation. And let me just define those. I I usually speak to groups that are focusing primarily on climate change. So if I use words or talk about issues that seem obscure to you, please raise your hand and ask me to clarify them. Sustainable development and climate change overlap by a lot, but there's a real tendency to jump into jargon. I have a real tendency to jump into jargon. So let me talk about mitigation, and before I start that, I'll say that John Holdren, who used to be at Harvard University and is now President Obama's science advisor, has been engaged in climate change issues for decades. And John talks about how we as a human society, as human societies, we really have three options in response to climate change. We can try to mitigate climate change. That just means that we can reduce our emissions, we can slow down deforestation, we can take actions that will manage climate change, that will actually slow it down, make the impacts less severe. That's mitigation. We can adapt to climate change. The fact is, the climate is changing whether we like it or not, and no matter what we do today, our climate is going to continue to change. We can't stop climate change. You can't just turn it around. So what we as human societies and what ecosystems and species are going to have to do is adapt to climate change. We're going to have to find ways to adapt our own behavior so that we can handle the kinds of new challenges that we're facing. So mitigation and adaptation are two of John Holdren's alternatives. He says there's only one other, and that is suffering. That if we don't find ways to mitigate, to cut down on the effects of climate change, or ways to adapt effectively to it, to reduce our vulnerabilities to climate change, then we as humans and ecosystems are going to be suffering the effects of climate change. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what we're talking about when we talk about an ethic or ethics. This really is just a set of principles of right conduct. It's about what's fair and just. It's rules or standards that we think we should be following throughout our lives. A lot of people use the term moral philosophy to cover it. It's really just about rights and responsibilities. And Don, Peter's already talked about the white paper on the ethical implications of climate change that Don headed up. This was a really amazing effort of bringing people together from quite a number of different countries to talk about the ethical implications of climate change. And please come in. The definition of ethics that is used in that paper is the field of philosophical inquiry that examines concepts and their employment about what is right and wrong, obligatory and non-obligatory, and when responsibility should attach to human actions that cause harm. And this responsibility is really important, and it's one of the big things that we'll be talking about today. Okay. And again, we're talking about issues of fairness, issues of justice, duties that we have to other people or duties that we have to nature, and responsibilities. So these are our values. These are our deeply felt values, what we think is important and what principles we think should be guiding our behavior. Now, why climate ethics? And this is a really important issue. Why are we even talking about ethics in the context with climate change? Now, we're talking about what's just and fair, and each and every one of us makes judgments every day about what we think is right or something we think is wrong. We see someone taking an action, we say, I don't think they should have done that. That wasn't the right thing to do. We're used to making those judgments. We're used to making them for ourselves, and we're certainly used to judging other people. Some of us are better at that than at judging ourselves. We need to bring that ability to make decisions about what's just and fair to the question of climate change. And let me give you a couple of quotes of what other